they came ready to play. They had all of these executive orders drafted up. It's some combination of Stephen Miller and Russ Vought. We could go down the list of who the key players are. But these are like surgical strikes on these remaining redoubts and power centers of the left. And it's not haphazard at all. This is very well planned. It's been exceptionally well executed. The right has accumulated its own kind of energy, its own kind of ability to execute, its own kind of competence, a roster of people who can actually get things done, a kind of talent pool.
Hi, welcome. This is the From the New World podcast. Today I'm speaking with Lomez, also known as Jonathan Kieperman. He's the founder of Passage Press, something we'll surely be diving into. We discuss the flurry of Trump executive orders, elite theorists like Curtis Yarvin and where they might have went wrong, starting a publishing company and finding rare, overlooked talent, and what history might be able to teach us about the roiling conflicts about what conservatism means. If you like the episode, the best way to help us out is to let a friend know, either in person or online. That way, you're not only helping us, but you're helping a friend find something interesting and informative. Speaking of things that are interesting and informative, if you like what Jonathan has to say, a great place to help him out and hopefully help yourself out as well is passage.press, the website for his publishing company where you'll find plenty of interesting books. Without further ado, here's Jonathan Kieperman. Welcome, Jonathan Kieperman. Lomez, welcome to the podcast.
Brian, it's great to be here. Good to see you again. Let's get to it.
So the latest news, apparently you have these voluntary buyouts for federal employees. We're retiring the federal employees. The same letter got sent to the CIA recently.
There's a few different ways I think you can think about these ongoing developments within the federal government, and tracks along like two different ideological models. And there's like a lot of overlap here. And so it's hard to say which of these ideological models is prevailing or running things. So there's the Elon Musk style, what I just call like classic libertarian small government ethos that is driving a lot of what we're seeing at Doge. Okay, you're just like identifying waste and abuse and fraud and unnecessary expenditures. And it is just a kind of small government objective that you're trying to achieve through these various moves. That's the, and I think probably that's what's driving Elon Musk. That's what motivates him, is he's upset about the lack of efficiency in government, for example, or just like wasteful spending. And that's fine. But then there is a kind of more, I don't know, esoteric kind of ideological lens that you could interpret this through, which is the kind of, I don't want to jump too far ahead of ourselves, but the more sort of Yarvin-esque, or not even necessarily Yarvin-esque, but that the federal government is a tool of the left, of a progressive sort of leftist ideological project that has been in place, if you take Yarvin seriously, since the 17th century, okay? But at least, let's say, more conservatively, since the 1960s. And there's been this long march through the institutions on the part of the left, which includes and is especially true within these federal bureaucracies. And while waste is a part of what we're trying to solve for by getting rid of all these people, the larger project is rooting out this leftist, progressive sort of ideology and its apparatchiks from the federal government so that we can reset the playing field and begin again with to use the analogy of a chessboard, it's just like a new game. Okay, we're going to reset the pieces and start over again. So for now, again, just to cap this all off in summary, you could interpret this through either one of those things. And I think maybe both might be true simultaneously. So yeah, that's my broad interpretation of what's going on.
Yeah, yeah, and to add a little bit of complexity there, I think going after USAID,
Yeah.
that's one of the big targets early on. And I think even like Elon himself has talked about this, that like USAID is funding these foreign kind of left wing journalists or
Yeah.
these other programs. So I think you laid it out as a binary, and we can get into the nuance there. But I think like even Elon himself, he buys into the second idea as well, right? He cares about costs, but he also cares about whether these dollars are funding a kind of left wing ideology.
I think that's probably true. And I think more recently, Elon has become more sensitive to the ideological valence of the federal bureaucracy. Maybe even 2 years ago, he would have looked at this in more ideologically neutral terms. It would have just been like generic government bloat that he's trying to get rid of. And I think, yeah, to use a phrase, he's been red pilled over the last few years. But that kind of what we might derisively call Reddit libertarianism has certainly become something deeper, more complex, more ideologically motivated. And certainly what I think the maybe difference between Elon now and Elon then is that has recognized a kind of friend enemy distinction within our politics. And he's aware now that there are, broadly speaking, there's a kind of left faction and a red faction. And the left faction is his enemy, so to speak. The right faction, whatever disagreements he might have with its various constituents, is his ally, at least in the near term. And he started to behave accordingly. You see this like in social media, for instance, the way he talks about the left and about these USAID programs. And so, yeah, I think you're right. I think it's not maybe quite as strictly binary as I might have made it sound in my initial answer. But I also think like with the USAID thing, I could be wrong about this, but I doubt that was like Elon's himself initial directive. I think that probably was coming from the State Department. Marco Rubio has, in particular, been central to identifying USAID as a target. And that stems from Rubio's time as a senator and trying to get answers about what USAID is up to. And certainly a lot of this, like the hidden, it's not even so much hidden, but the underlying story here is COVID. Okay. And what happened with COVID and what was USAID's relationship with these various organizations and NGOs and international health organizations that might have maybe either produced COVID. That's the sort of maximalist view, right? That they actually funded the research that made COVID. But even at minimum, were responsible for the public health response, which struck directly at the kind of freedoms and liberties, et cetera, that Elon, of course, just instinctively prefers over government control. So, yeah, that's a long, rambling way of agreeing with you.
Yeah, and for the audience, let's be clear. What is that relationship with the what's the relationship with funding the gain of function research?
Yeah, I'm claiming I'm agnostic on this. Okay, my belief is actually that there was probably some funding, and it very well could be that COVID was made in a lab using money that came from the EcoHealth Alliance, for example. I read. I didn't actually watch the videos, but I read the recap of that debate. That there's this like Bayesian. I think he's an
Yeah,
Israeli or
yeah.
something. There's the
So
bet.
we don't have to get into
Yeah,
how likely was it that it was a lab leak versus
yeah,
versus a natural origin versus some secret third thing.
yeah.
Talked about it on the podcast with a few
Okay.
different guests before, but I just want to say to be clear, I believe they funded EcoHealth Alliance directly.
Yeah.
USAID funded EcoHealth Alliance directly,
I don't even
which is
think
then funded the Wuhan lab.
is that up for debate that USAID funded EcoHealth? I saw some clips of Rand Paul interrogating Samantha Power about who was formerly the director at USAID under Biden, and about money that came from USAID that went to at least like EcoHealth affiliates. It sounds through perhaps UC Davis was the node that this money passed through. I don't know if that's even up for dispute, but I could be wrong about that. I am curious, Brian. Sorry, I don't want to get derailed, but I am curious. Like, what is your belief about that? Do you think that it came from the lab?
There are flaws from both sides of the story, really. I think that's one of the most infuriating things that was running through my mind during that debate. I'll link it below for viewers who are interested. And there's something about there were these kind of proposals of modifying viruses in ways that are reflected in the ultimate COVID virus, ultimate the COVID virus that actually happened. There is also some discrepancies of the timeline of what it would look like if it was indeed an accidental lab leak. There's more of a delay, and there's also just flaws with the direct like tracing of the individual scientists who may have been the ones who were infected and then caused the lab leak. So there's discrepancies in both sides of the story, so it's hard to nail down. There could theoretically be a third narrative that handles some of these discrepancies. But as Peter Thiel said, we would really need some truth and reconciliation
Yeah.
to figure out or to even approach such a third narrative.
Yeah. Which I don't think we're going to get. I don't think there is the political will on either side to actually find out what happened. I think the energy is merely to punish people who are perceived to have covered certain things up, or again from this public health response perspective created sort of these add-on problems that cost people a ton of money and was a real violation of our basic expectations of personal freedoms and etc. So yeah, I think the political will is like to punish at this point, which by the way I'm all for. I think that's an appropriate way to spend political energy on this problem.
Yeah, I think that. Oh, before I forget, quick fact check. We're
Okay.
doing the fact check still, but I am on the EcoHealth Alliance page right now. They are indeed funded by USAID,
Yeah.
according to themselves. So I think that's solid evidence right there. I think that the political dynamic with COVID is really interesting. I think some of these more niche questions, these questions Peter Thiel might be interested in asking, I'm interested in asking as well. That might not be a spotlight, but I think there are some issues like with censorship, with
Mhm.
coordination and politicization of the CDC,
Yeah.
where I think there's real potential to push against thermostatic public opinion. And thermostatic public opinion for the audience is just this tendency, especially recently, for people to be anti incumbent. The thermostat, if the temperature drops too low, it bounces back. If it goes too high, it also bounces back. The idea is that the same is true in politics, that whatever party's in power, they're going to overreach and people are going to react. And that's why you get bad midterm results for the last, I think, since Bush won, you get bad midterm results. And Bush won, of course, that was an extenuating circumstance. That was 9/11. And one possible way that might change, one possible way that Trump can build his lead, aside from just doing popular policies, is to really uncover what's happened. Because I think that right now there are still some fundamental myths. There are some deep fundamental myths that I'm sure we'll talk about too. But there are some fundamental myths just of the past few years
Mm.
that the Trump administration is really in position to overturn. And I think COVID is at the heart of that. The social media censorship is at
Yeah.
the heart of that. And I think it could be one of the most politically valuable things that they do.
Yeah, I guess it's just a matter of priorities and where you're going to allocate various resources and also calibrating the response to certain kinds of moves that the Trump administration makes, calibrating the response from like mainstream media, who still, I mean, my hunch, my perception is that the power of mainstream media is badly degraded, even since
Oh,
let's say four
absolutely.
years ago. However, it's still very powerful to a certain community of, frankly, like highly influential subset of Democrat voters. And if okay, so let's think about this. If let's say Trump is trying to figure out a way to preserve this momentum through the midterms and prevent that kind of whiplash that you're describing, that sort of electoral whiplash that maybe has been the norm over the last couple decades. He can do this by relitigating, let's say, COVID, the social media censorship that arose from COVID, but also as a response to BLM stuff, as a response to like Russiagate, certainly the 2020 election, the stuff like the election fraud, which you weren't allowed to talk about. If you were like a mainstream pundit, even on the right, there was no way to. So what we've seen, for example, is you can now relitigate the origins of COVID. Like smart serious people can do that, and there isn't like that knee jerk reflexive pushback you used to see, that would just instantly call anyone doing that like a dangerous conspiracy theorist or something. Okay, can we get to the point where we can have those kinds of conversations around like election fraud in the 2020 election? I don't know. I don't know if that's on the horizon anytime soon. I don't know if there's an appetite for it. I frankly don't know if it actually matters that much. So what I guess I'm questioning here is like, what is the value of Trump and the right going back, turning around and relitigating, spending political energy, and in this negotiation with the New York Times, for example, or the Washington Post, whoever it might be, relitigating things like Russiagate or COVID, versus just creating all of these new, exciting possibilities for the next 4 years. So the promise of owning Greenland and the Panama Canal, and now like Gaza, which I think is fake, by the way, but or like annexing Canada. It's like every week there's a new exciting cliffhanger that you're waiting for the next week to resolve. And does that kind of momentum that he's creating, is that enough to sustain the electoral interests of voters through the midterms, A, in conjunction with B, what is obviously a kind of impotent left right now? Like they're just out of energy. There's nothing happening on the left that's really interesting or inspiring at all. They're not really able to motivate their activists to do anything like outwardly, publicly. It's just people sniping on blue sky. I just don't think that actually matters that much right now. So that's B. Yeah, and those two things in and also, okay, so I would say there's a C piece of this too, which is a general cultural vibe shift happening where like a lot of young people, but also then maybe previously apolitical or like fence sitters, people in the middle, are now open to a Trump plus tech alliance. And that's exciting. That's because it's new. It's still novel. And we're still like, it's still converting like a lot of people, I think. Okay, so those three things combined, Trump, the constant like episodic cliffhanger, storyteller Trump, there's the enervated, impotent left, and then there's this vibe shift where all that energy is now being transferred to this new coalition on the right. Are those three things what's going to drive Trumpism through the midterms and onward into a second Vance or into a Vance presidency? And then you just don't need to worry about all that other stuff that came before. We just all agree to collectively move past it.
Yeah, that's a. I think that there are good precedents for both, and that's one of the things that are tricky. That's tricky about trying to understand this moment. A lot is up in the air, and there's so many things that you could compare it to. in the past, and it could really go either way. I think that an optimistic message could totally be the message that ends up winning that ends up winning the midterms in 2026, that ends up winning JD 2028. I think that's really possible. And to be clear, these don't have to be mutually exclusive either.
Right.
You
Yeah.
can do the truth and reconciliation, and you can also campaign on making Greenland a state, and many of these other, I think, genuinely transformative in a positive way, genuinely transformative projects. I think you can do both. I
Yeah,
do
I think
think
that's right.
there are. Sorry, go on.
No, sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you, but the thing that I realize I'm like leaving out of this tapestry of interests that might be highlighted over the next 2 to 4 years is that also if you're going to look back and do a kind of truth and reconciliation on a variety of things that have failed over the last 4 years. I actually don't think you want to focus on COVID so much. I think you point your
Was
finger, you
under
do the
Trump.
Chris Rufo thing and you point your finger at wokeness, DEI. Okay. People hate it. People hate it. Hated it. I think people, especially like centrist libs too, recognize that it was a really bad sort of cultural and political trend. And if you're going to point at something as a kind of warning of what the other side is about, then COVID is, I don't know. I think COVID's a part of that discussion, but I think the thing you're concentrating on is just like the general political trends that are encapsulated by this thing we call wokeness.
Yeah, I think you're right. It's the wokeness, the kind of social media censorship angle,
Hmm.
HR, the DEI trainings, that was always a lot more hot to the touch than the COVID truth and
Hmm.
reconciliation after the fact. During the time period, it was obviously hot to the touch for obvious reasons. Everyone's in their homes, they are physically affected. At the same time, I think you're right. People don't necessarily want to look back on that. They don't necessarily want to look back on wokeness either, but there's more of an argument there, right? It's harder
Yeah,
for Democrats to say we're not doing COVID again.
it's more accessible. Look, like
Yeah, yeah,
we
exactly.
have a kind of, I think we share a certain kind of discourse community, but it's like relatively narrow. And maybe within that discourse community, there's like interest in talking about fair and cleavage sites. But how accessible is that to like the country, to the electorate? I don't think very. I like any truth and reconciliation with regards to COVID would very quickly get into really dense technical detail, and people would just tune out. I think. Whereas if the focus is on a kind of post mortem on wokeness, that's something that lends itself much better, and frankly, to like polemics and the kind of discourse that can slot into a number of different levels of people's commitment to politics. So anyway, I think it's just like a broader, there's a bigger audience for that.
Yeah, wokeness, it's really a beautiful thing. Not wokeness itself, to be
Yeah.
clear, but the politics of it. Because, yeah, you can have I interviewed Richard Hanania one
Uh-huh.
or two episodes ago. You can have the autist law nerds who really care about
Yeah.
Executive Order 11246. And you can also have,
Yeah.
I think, really anyone can feel this if you're watching one of the videos, or God forbid you're in one of these trainings and they're talking about how evil white people are and
Yeah.
their original sins, and how they can't stop themselves from being racist, and it's just horrible, and everyone can see that. And you can reach everyone. There's both the really dense substance and the intellectual history and the political and legal history of it, and there's also just the slap in the face. They're both there.
Yep. Yep. Yeah. And so you can have the Marjorie Taylor Greene version and then the more like elevated version that lands in the New York Times or whatever, or that is, but no less compelling to like people in Silicon Valley who are trying to build AI companies. So it's not just that it's accessible, it's also relevant to everyone on the stack. Whereas the relevance of COVID and unwinding these complex funding streams and the precise nature of this sort of research and the frankly there are like okay yeah there are arguments for and against. I don't know, you just it's not as relevant, it's not as relevant to everybody, it's not as relevant to lived experience of most people.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. But maybe we're going to dive deeper into the. This isn't Fox News. We're going to dive deeper into the things that might be less relevant, but hopefully very relevant
Yeah,
for this audience. You mentioned there Curtis Yarvin.
yeah,
Curtis has been on this podcast. We don't always agree on everything. You'll be able to tell that if you listen to the episode.
yeah,
We'll link it below. But it's just been really interesting seeing some of his ideas being put to the test.
yeah.
I think one of the main ideas that was put to the test was this idea of elite theory. Let's go more into how exactly they were put to the test a bit later. But do you want to just talk briefly about the ideas of Curtis or of Pareto and Mosca, so on?
Sure, I'll give the
The Cliff
crude
Notes.
Cliff Notes version, which is, and it's like a very simple concept, which is this the notion of a populist rule is a delusion. There's no such thing as rule from the bottom or rule from the middle. There's only rule from the kind of top layer. Let's call it 5%, 10%, whatever you want to call it. Okay. And when there's an actual sort of change in the substance of a government or a society, it's not ever the case that it's the bottom percolating up to the top and taking over these institutions. It's a transfer from one set of elites to another, and one set of elites might have as its constituency some segment of the middle and lower parts of the society and will be serving their interests, and through that arrangement are conferred the authority from those segments to serve as the elite sort of policymakers, the decision makers. And then you'll have another set of elites that has its own sort of second and third layers of constituents that are granting it its authority to make decisions and replace that other segment of elites. So Curtis, and I think, by the way, my own feeling is this is one way that Curtis is correct. I do think that it is a transfer to the extent that there is. I don't even want to use this term is so loaded, but I'm just going to use it because it's the kind of terminology that you hear is like regime change. To the extent you get something like a regime change, it is through the transfer of power from one group of elites to a counter group of elites. And okay, you wanted before we get into whether that's been like proven out here, you want to just address that as a definitionally.
Yeah, yeah,
Okay.
and I agree with your characterization. I think it's right, and I think it's important because it pushes back on this idea of pure democracy. And
Yeah.
you'll hear the idea that we're not a democracy, we're a republic, and we have things like the Supreme Court, and we have things like the Electoral College, and that's all well and good. But this is a bit more of a pushback against that idea. This is the idea that even the concept, the ideal of rule by the people, of vox populi,
Yeah.
vox dei, even that ideal, it's just impossible because when people organize, when people try to communicate, when people try to get stuff done, it's always going to be intermediated by these elites.
Yeah, that's right. And either intermediated or the wherever the interests of the populace at large either runs against the interests of some other aspect of the populace at large or runs against the interests of the elites. In any instance, it's the elites negotiating the resolution to that conflict. Like the populace doesn't even get to participate in that negotiation, except to the extent that they have a certain amount of. And this is where, okay, communists or the left would say no, actually they do have power. Okay, they can like march in the streets and they can unions can strike, etc. I think there's some truth to that, but someone like I don't know that I necessarily believe this how far I'd want to take this, but someone like Yarvin would say actually no, to the extent that the populace can organize itself to do that, it's because elites are telling them to, are influencing them and formulating their opinions and using their superposition over them to nudge their behavior toward that kind of action. No, there's the whole idea of like organic interest among the populace is also, it's not even that they don't like control the levers of power, they don't even control the formulation of their own interests.
Yeah,
Again, I don't know if I'd take it that far. I wouldn't take it that far, but that's like the maximalist position of elite theory.
I think going into the examples actually really helps. Because what's the difference between Trump 1 and Trump 2? Okay, he won the popular vote. He won, what was it, like 2 more percent. That 2 more percent, that made a huge difference. I think his House margin is actually narrower than Trump 1.
Yeah.
And what's the big difference? Why is it so different this time? And the answer that a lot of people give, and to be honest, this is the answer I would give as well, is that they came in with a plan. The people were different. The people were people who actually wanted to get stuff done, who actually wanted to change the regime or at least
Yeah.
change the law. And they did.
Yeah.
Those elites came in, they had the executive orders lined up, and they did it. They changed the law, or at least changed the law within the bounds of the executive branch.
Yeah. Okay, so I'm formulating this as we speak. Okay, so I'm not sure how committed I am to this, but okay, there's the one version of this with regards to elite theory, as we were just discussing it, is that the populace looks around at the price of eggs, the price of their groceries, and their inflation, and there's like crime. There's crime everywhere, and people spilling across the border in unprecedented amounts, and they say to themselves, totally organically, based on a formulation of their interests, I want something else. I want somebody to do something about this. And then they see Trump as someone who's going to do something about this. The other version, though, is these things are all just latent, and at any point they can be activated as a kind of a justification for voting behavior, but they have to be activated by an elite class. So it's not that they're organically thinking these are the reasons I'm now going to vote for Trump, even though I didn't in 2016. It's the fact that someone like Elon Musk, let's say, or Mark Andreessen, or the people in the All In podcast can point to these things and say, okay, it's now okay for you to adopt this position because we're telling you it's okay. And now you can vote. And what we want you, with the behavioral outcome that we want to provoke from you, is to now vote for Donald Trump. And they just do that. They do that because this upper layer class has basically told them to, which is independent of their perception of their interests that they would arrive at organically, if that makes sense. Yeah.
Yeah, I think there's so much of a question of the will of the people,
Yeah.
right? That's so much of the formulation, quite frankly, on the right, as much or even more as it is on the left. I mentioned the phrase "vox populi, vox Dei" earlier. I'm not sure if he's tweeted it recently, but Elon Musk loved tweeting that for some time, and it's really interesting because on one hand, you can look at this in a very Straussian way where it is just this justification, and whenever the momentum's on your side, you'll invoke that like a magic spell. Um, but you can also look at it as as a sincere belief, and as a sincere belief, I'm not sure how well justified it is even on the right.
Yeah, again, I'm not trying to like have it both ways or something. I just genuinely, it's a genuinely curious question for me, and I don't know. I haven't really
Yeah,
figured out
many
how I
such
feel about
cases.
it. And so I would say, though, I actually think like my gut is actually that Vox Populi, Vox Die, like the will of the people is real. It is real, actually. It is organic. It is independent of elite forces, but there's just a limit on what the material effects of that will can be. So, for example, in Trump's case, I've never witnessed a politician who's able to amass, or again, this is all like organic. If you remember, there were these like pickup truck caravans that you would see like in Pima, Arizona, and it's 4 miles of pickup trucks with guys with American flags and like Trump flags driving down the highway, or these like armadas like in Florida or off the coast of San Diego. All these guys who are obviously they got some money, they're driving expensive trucks or they have these boats. So this isn't like the lowest class of people. And okay, so there's a real will, there's like a real organic will, and that's as activated in the American context as I've ever seen it, but it can only go so far. There was this really powerful elite structure still in place who could keep it more or less tamped down. Now, Trump won the 2016 elections. There was a real like revolt of the masses that was very real, but Trump won was largely neutered in what he could accomplish. And so maybe what we're seeing now is a slightly diminished level of that popular will. Maybe not. I don't know. Maybe it's about the same. Certainly after the assassination attempt, maybe it got to be about the same level. But the difference now is that pressure coming down from elites has given out a little bit. That resistance has given out. And so we're now seeing the popular will able to percolate further up the chain and influence more of that elite, counter elite that's now in place.
Yeah, you have more buy-in. You have people who are at the elite level who still reflect the will of the average Trump voter, right? Like Stephen Miller,
Yeah, yep.
a
JD
lot of
Vance, I think,
people.
too.
Yeah, JD, excellent example. And they're the channel through which the will of the people flows. But you need both, right? You need
Yeah,
to execute, and you also need to actually win the election.
yeah, yeah.
Um, most of the time.
Yeah,
uh,
well,
but
that's right.
but what's really interesting about this is that, yeah, there's this big open question when it comes to the will of the people, of like how much of it is manufactured, how much of it is just whoever controls the propaganda machine, whoever
Yeah,
controls the Facebook algorithm, and how much of it is like a real human nature. And I think that if you go too far in one direction, then you end up with a narrative that could have never accepted Trump winning the election in 2016 or 2024. And if you go too far in the other direction, you can never have an explanation that explains like how Trump didn't govern in 2016 or 2017.
yeah. I
You
think
need
this
to,
is where
you
we
need both.
agree.
You need to account for both.
Yeah, I think this is where we agree where Curtis actually might be wrong. I think he overestimates the supremacy of the sort of elite level apparatuses and their ability to perfectly manipulate the will of the people. And so while he was right about 2016 in the sense that, yeah, the cathedral, the elites in place were able to absorb the popular will and redirect that energy in a way that sort of resisted any attempts to do anything real with that energy. They were like able to absorb it. And then in 2020, maybe he was right again that they had mastered at that point their ability to control this popular will and, let's say, manipulate certain kinds of procedural outcomes to get what they wanted vis-a-vis the election, whether you think it was formally stolen or just things like keeping the Hunter Biden laptop story off of Twitter changed the narrative enough to get what, or like the sort of fabrication of BLM riots over the course of the summer, or whatever they did with mail-in voting. Okay, these kind of informal ways of manipulating election outcomes. In any case, so they win there. I think this election has proven, however, that the popular will can actually at some point capture the interests of a counter elite who, within the system, And this is where I think Curtis's idea of the need for a monarchy is maybe wrong. I think all the things he thinks need to happen in order to exercise effective governance in the United States can happen within the current system. And that's what we're seeing right now. We're seeing the combination of popular will, and we'll call it like right wing just for sake of ease, although I think it's more complicated than that. But this kind of right wing will, this right wing populism, merge with the interests of a counter elite represented by people like Stephen Miller and JD Vance, and then to a slightly lesser extent like Elon Musk and Mark Andreessen and the All In people. And that combination of forces can overtake the incumbent elites. I don't think Curtis thought that was possible, at least in his writing. And I think we're demonstrating that it is possible.
Yeah, exactly. It's you can do the it's interesting. I'm actually so you might be more familiar with his writing as well, but yeah, he did have this article that was like an apology for. I'll link it below. Something like the joy of being wrong, or something like
Mhm.
that, where he says, "I didn't expect all of this to happen. I'm sorry to Chris Rufo." Literally, the Chris Rufo apology form. And
Yeah.
what's interesting is that in some ways, basically the thing that I'm trying to overcome right now is that on one hand I agree with Curtis about the importance of elites, and I feel like that broader idea was vindicated, right? And I'm trying to remember why exactly Curtis thought that the right wing could never have elites on their side, or had to have monarchy in order to get some of these reforms
Yeah.
through, because that's the part that I think has happened, right? And that in a way is confirming of many of these elite theory ideas, because yeah, you had the populace on your side, but you also had the elite on your side, and I think having the elite on your side really mattered in this case.
Yeah. It absolutely did. Okay, so I have a couple. I have a couple things I want to respond to there. One is Curtis's apology to like Chris Rufo, and for those who haven't read this article, it came out in the last week or so. It's like the most recent Substack piece I think he wrote, in which he acknowledges that his guess about what would happen even in a Trump win, he thought it would be like 2016, where he wouldn't be able to get anything accomplished. And he admit that his prediction about this is wrong, has been wrong. But Curtis leaves himself a kind of clever out. And Curtis's clever out is the reason he was wrong is not because of something the right did, but because of something the left lacks. And so the thesis is that the reason the right is able to like do stuff all of a sudden is because the left is missing what he calls, I think the term he uses is moral energy,
Yes.
that the kind of activism that we saw in 2020, let's say, riots, people in the streets, or if you go back to this time 8 years ago in 2017, when Trump's first couple months in office, like Women's March, you had
Resistance.
yeah, the resistance. You had the start of the Russiagate affair. 17 agencies have signed off saying that this was an illegitimate election. You had I looked this up a couple weeks ago. It was February 17th that the Washington Post changed their tagline to "Democracy dies in darkness." And this, of course, is like this symbolic, very theatrical gesture about the danger of Donald Trump. And this was the first time we started really hearing like mainstream discourse. This has been an idea in academic circles, but about like misinformation and disinformation and okay, this whole thing that was then used for the next 8 years as this kind of cudgel against Trump. So Curtis's argument is like all of that energy has dissipated. It's just, I don't know, it's exhausted itself. Why and how is like up for debate, but it's exhausted itself, which is true. But what Curtis doesn't give Trump credit for, and at least not to the extent that I think Trump deserves, or just broadly this right wing coalition deserves, is the things that they did proactively. They came ready to play. They
Yeah.
had all of these executive orders drafted up. It's some combination of Stephen Miller and Russ Vought, and we could go down the list of who the key players are. But these are like surgical strikes on these remaining redoubts and power centers of the left. And it's not haphazard at all. This is very well planned. It's been exceptionally well executed. And so there's something else going on here beyond just the left faltering, the left running out of energy. The right has accumulated its own kind of energy, its own kind of ability to execute, its own kind of competence, a roster of people who can actually get things done, a kind of talent pool. And this is the thing that I didn't really necessarily anticipate, although I'd hoped for, was that the right could actually fill out a roster of super talented people to get this stuff done. I think that was like the open question, and it turns out, no, actually, the right does have a lot of really talented people. There is a meaningful core of what could become a more substantial counter elite to fill out potentially the entirety of the federal government.
Oh yeah. And what's really interesting is I don't want to undersell Doge. I don't want to undersell Elon. They matter as well, but a lot of the people here were are not necessarily the kind of tech
Right.
insurgents. There, Stephen Miller, we already
Yep.
talked about him. Russ Vought, he was around and Trump won. A lot of the people involved were around for the full ride,
Yeah.
and it's interesting because you can say from a kind of narrow conception of elite, if they were elite now, why weren't they elite before? But I do think there was a kind of maturation or a kind of understanding of, oh, this is dire, this is serious. We need to have a plan if we not just a plan of what we want to do with the government, but how to do it at a very granular level. And that's something that really changed.
So it's interesting to track what is so how did this counter elite form, and where did they come from, and where were they previously? That's a really good question to ask. Um, okay, so first of all, yeah, I want to amplify the point you made that I talk to a lot of tech friends. Okay, our tech friends who some of them are on the have been on the right for a long time, others have come along recently, and there is a kind of, I don't want to say narcissistic perception, but there is a perception that, okay, yeah, all this talent is because we're involved now and we've brought along these really smart young people. And this is true. Okay. You look at Doge, for example, and the people they brought along. Yeah, these are like, that's tech talent. Okay. That's tech talent that's coming into the right, but that was not previously activated in any kind of political way on the right. But there is, Stephen Miller is a good example of this. Now, Stephen Miller has a more public profile, so people have seen him and are aware of his existence. I don't want to like name names here because these are people I know and who are
Yeah, I
operating
don't
in
want the eye of
DC.
Sauron going on them.
Yeah, and I just don't want to blow that up, okay? But suffice to say that for every Stephen Miller, there are like 10 other guys in DC somewhere, and this is important, in the age range of like late 20s up to 50, okay? That's the break point. I mean, with exceptions on either end, okay? But who are super talented and have all the same credentials as the left elites, and were have access to all the same jobs, and they're in, maybe were previously working in finance, or maybe they were working in politics but they were quietly squirreled away at some think tank somewhere working on random policy stuff that most people don't hear about or care about. And so what's happened is generational turnover on the right. This began in 2016 when Trump defeated the conservative establishment, such that there was such a thing. And this maybe is represented by best by the Bush family. So Jeb Bush, but also includes like Mitt Romney, includes people like Paul Ryan, who's an exemplar of a certain kind of conservative politics that at one point looked to be ascendant And Trump just wiped out that entire class of establishment Republican. The establishment Republicans, along with the left, for the last like 4 years, 8 years, but getting increasingly weak as you move through time, was also resisting Trumpism and trying to reclaim Republicanism for themselves. And these were big think tanks, for example, that were responsible for staffing the last Trump administration. They were responsible for making selections about which congressmen sit on which committees and all the other millions of decisions that determine how things get done in Washington. What we've seen since probably like 2000, basically when Trump, there was this question about Ron DeSantis, like where he fits in with this, and I don't want to get into the nuances there. Let's just say that once it became clear that Trump was now going to be the candidate for the Republicans in 2024, there was this massive kind of the final stages of that turnover happened. All those old establishment Republican people either got on board or they were put out to pasture. Now there's like a few exceptions. I would say like there's just a few people in Congress or in the Senate, like Mitch McConnell, okay, is an example of a kind of dinosaur who's still around representing the old way of doing things. He's transactional in a way, but for the most part now what's happened is those younger elites within the Republican establishment who were in opposition dispositionally, but also in terms of beliefs with that establishment layer of the conservative movement, have now replaced them all. Okay. There's just been this massive replacement from establishment conservatives to now what is like the Stephen Miller, Darren Beatty, Mike Anton wing of the Republican Party. And what's really interesting too to me is someone like Marco Rubio, who at one time, this was like Gang of Eight, immigration deal, John McCain,
Yeah,
Jeb
ran
Bush,
against Trump as
Republican.
a moderate.
He's just completely flipped. Okay. He's now on board. And yeah, these guys just, they either flipped, they became Trump guys, or they're out or they're gone. And so now these younger elites, these younger Republican counter elites, are now in positions of decision making.
Yeah, and it I've been here in DC now for a few years. It's just been fascinating to watch. And I can attest to the same thing you said. There are a lot of talented young people here in DC. There are a lot of people who are really competent, who were here before the kind of tech wave. I think the tech wave, surely many of those people are competent as well. But yeah, it's been moving for I think more than a decade now. It's been moving since 2016 at least.
But I don't see it as like a continuous sort of turnover. It was like the talent pool was building underneath the layer of people who were making decisions. And that talent pool was filling up. And it's really been in the last like year or two that talent pool of younger people got to capacity. And that top layer of decision makers are now just out. And that talent pool is now making decisions. So yeah, like I think you're right. It's been happening since 2016, but the visible parts of it have changed all at once. And like we're just like the last 2 weeks, we're just like finally seeing that. What does that look like in practice? It's this flurry of executive orders. It's completely rewriting the script on foreign policy. It's completely rewriting the script on our trade policies, our domestic policies, and it feels like a sudden sea change. And so like in some ways it is, in other ways like you're describing, it has been this slow build.
Yeah, it's a trickle and then it's a flood.
Yeah, yeah,
Um, let's take a step back. Uh,
sure.
I think you're someone who's contributed to this, who's played a great role in all of this happening, and you did that through, I think, maybe an unconventional way by running Passage Press.
Yeah.
What is Passage Press?
So in short, all this stuff we're talking about, this new wave of um So it's politics, but it's also a kind of cultural wave, cultural sea change that is inclusive of elements of the tech right. It's inclusive of the kind of online right, and maybe that's firstly where it came from. But it's a publishing house that is trying to aggregate all of this um, collection of people and interests that are representative of whatever's coming next. And it has a political valence for sure. And some of our early work
A little bit.
deals in the theory, the sort of philosophy and theory that has given rise to, or it's what's interesting, it's a question like just how much, it's a question of degrees, but of all these people we're talking about, one through line is like everybody has read Curtis Yarvin. They like whether they agree with him or not is a separate question, but they've all read Curtis Yarvin, they've read Nick Land, they've read Steve Saylor, and in some sense, what the publishing house is and what we're trying to aggregate here is the intellectual ballast atop which this movement, I hate that word, okay, but it's going to suffice for now, so this movement can be built. And yeah, becoming a kind of center of gravity for all the ideas, concepts, themes, aesthetics that are going to drive what happens in American culture going forward. That's the big hope.
Why don't you like calling it a movement?
Okay, because it's more amorphous than that. A movement implies a destination or an objective, a clear objective to me. It's moving towards something specific. I think it's more diffuse than that. I also don't, and this isn't about like branding or anything. I don't want to peg myself or this project to some sort of concrete or defined ideology or set of interests or even set of people. I think a culture has to be more open than that. Any kind of sustainable culture and interesting culture, kinetic culture has to constantly be coming into contact with new ideas and new ways of thinking. And a movement implies something that to me is a little bit more closed.
Yeah, I think that's perfectly fair. And this kind of culture, this goes back to what we were talking about, the majority and about the will of the people.
Uh-huh.
Where does that culture come from?
That's right. Actually, I guess I would ask, okay,
It's a big
where does
question for
the
passage press, right?
what's that?
It's a big question for passage press, right?
Yeah, okay. So the people, the stories and narratives and ideas that the populace writ large receive and use to orient their lives around the symbols that are salient to them and that they use as a way for self-identification, that happens, I honestly like through, okay, this is like going to sound cringe or something, but it's like through song and like local religious community. And it's happening at this level that's like closer to the ground, let's say, in some sense. Okay, I want to say about all this stuff, there's like these streams that, there's these feedback loops. It's not going just in one direction or the other. There's like constant feedback loops. Okay, so what I'm saying here is that the what like passage maybe is trying to do is actually create narratives, themes, symbols, etc., that are for what amounts to a counter elite. These are the people who read books. Okay, I don't mean to sound like, I don't know, classist about this or something or whatever. It's like a smallish segment of the population that reads books. Okay, so let's just be honest about that. So who's reading books? It's like a certain kind of person. And what I guess we're trying to deliver to those people is a new set of narratives around which to orient our ambitions about the future, which are, of course, informed by our understanding of the past. And the legacy set of narratives that we are seeking, frankly, to replace, both are the stories they tell about the past, in my view, are largely obsolete or incomplete or both. And we're determined to achieve certain kind of objectives for a moment in history that is just no longer relevant. I'm thinking about like the end of history, Cold War, etc. Like we're out of that moment. We're into some new moment now, and what comes next, and the kind of questions we have to answer for ourselves, questions around ethics, and okay, questions around what happens with AI, what happens with genetic engineering and like children, and what is the way to understand ourselves as humans in relationship to these machines that will, at least presumably or possibly in the very near future, start interacting with our human selves in these very deep ways that are unprecedented. Okay, all that kind of stuff. So how do we formulate new narratives that can take all of this new stuff into account? And that this is like very grandiose sounding, I know, but this is like what we're trying to do. This is what I think we're trying to do with our books, with our authors, introducing new information into the system.
I think if you want anyone fostering a new culture, you want someone who thinks it's grandiose. So I think that's a great thing to believe. Have confidence. There's a lot there and a lot important, and it's hard to choose. It's hard to choose between them. Something that really interests me about Passage is that you guys publish a lot of different stuff. You publish classics, you publish novels, you republished Ernst Jünger.
Yeah.
That might be actually. I love Curtis, I love Steve, I love a lot of these people, but and I have great respect for them. Um, there's such a wide selection of books that you publish. It's not a lot of boutique publishing houses will focus on one thing. They'll just focus on not even just novels in general, maybe like a specific subsection of
Yeah.
novel or a specific branch of philosophy. You guys do publish philosophy as well. You published Curtis, you've published Nick Land. What goes into choosing a work to publish in Passage?
Yeah. It's not, it may look a little bit haphazard and it is like this broad
But it's
selection,
not, right?
but it's not haphazard. Okay. So, okay, I'm starting from this premise, the sort of creative mental landscape that most, especially young people, are walking around with is completely bombed out, like nuclear wasteland. Okay. And conversely, the kind of narrative landscape that like boomers, for example, are walking around with is just filled up with these outdated scripts that are leading them, into making all sorts of false assumptions about the future and mistakes that don't map on to reality as it is. It maps on to an old reality that just no longer obtains. Okay. And then the upshot there is that this mental landscape, the kind of intellectual or mental creative narrative wallpaper that we're all walking around inside of, and that fills up our kind of visual field, needs to be replaced. It needs like a total renovation. And what I'm trying to do with Passage across these different selections of books and authors is fill up that mental space with a kind of functional, like garden, like mini ecosystem. And you want, imagine you're replanting a forest or something. You need like biodiversity. You need like different things in there that all interact with each other in these complex ways. So there's that. So I'm trying to think about, okay, what is like the interaction between someone like Ernst Younger and Curtis? It's not direct. It's not like there's a direct relationship. Now, in some cases, there are, like Nick Land and Curtis Yarvin and Steve Saylor actually do fit a very direct scheme. But how that interacts with Ernst Jünger and the short stories of H.P. Lovecraft and Robert E. Howard and like the original Hardy Boys, for example, or the memoir of Peter Wrangle, Always with Honor. That's like more complex. And it's actually, and yeah, okay. It's not random, but it is also a little bit experimental where you don't actually know how all of these different things are going to interact. I'm trusting my gut that there's a kind of vibe that they all share. There's this rule in cooking where you're supposed to combine ingredients that like grow together or live near each other. And I think that idea might apply here too. Younger and Peter Wrangle live together. They like grow in the same soil, so to speak. So there's a kind of connection there. And okay, so there's that. But then there's like a more immediate selection of process here, which is I'm looking for stuff that is important, okay, that I think is important, like good literature that does tell these interesting stories about the past or provides new insights into what or analysis into what's happening right now. The other criteria is that you can't find them elsewhere or they're hard to find elsewhere. These aren't things that you're going to encounter in your college lit seminar or your college history class. You have to go out and search for this stuff by and large. It's not easy to get. And then, just as a business matter, I'm also thinking about, is there a market for this? Do I think that people would want to buy this, or can I sell it to them? Is there a hook here? Is there a way to, you know, persuade people that this particular material is relevant to their experience somehow or their understanding of the world? So I guess, yeah, that's it. That's the kind of very broad sort of selection that I'm going process that I'm going through.
Yeah, the visual that came up when you said you're creating this selection, you're creating this reset, is almost you have Noah's Ark and
Yeah.
God floods the world. You have two of each species and they go out, and
Yeah.
you don't want it all to blow up, right? You choose
Yeah.
the wrong. You put the wolf and the sheep together, and maybe it wasn't worth saving those sheep after all, right? So you have to be careful about these things. And
Yeah, it
yeah,
is,
yeah,
but you're right. It's like this menagerie and it's a kind of zoo or whatever the right metaphor here is. But that's right. Yeah, yeah. We're there's been this like sort of catastrophe, this cultural catastrophe. Hyperbolic is it to say that? I don't know, but it certainly feels that way to me. Feels that way to me since maybe for the last couple decades. And yeah, we need to rebuild. We need to go start all over again. That doesn't mean abandoning all the stuff that came before. There's incredible value, obviously, in all that stuff. So you're not starting from scratch. This is not like a blank slate you're building out from. It's going to be informed by the past, but yeah, we're escaping a flood. We're escaping a cataclysm.
yeah. And the exact nature of that catastrophe, it's interesting because I think there are some areas where you will get immense pushback, and some areas where even from people in the field they feel this,
Yeah.
where I think people have an understanding that there's been a stagnation in like theater, right? That no one has gotten as good as Shakespeare, and people now, like hundreds of years after Shakespeare, are probably even worse than people like dozens of years after Shakespeare. It's just gone. I think with architecture, a lot of people are also willing to say
Yeah.
this, even many architects. In some other areas, music, visual art is in a middle position here. There's more resistance to that idea. And so you get this kind of uneven stagnation or uneven perception of stagnation. Not sure which one is more accurate. How are you thinking about the stagnation or the decline and fall of Western culture? Like, how did that happen? And what's the kind of pattern of decay?
Okay. This is such a good question. I have a couple of ideas. I have a couple of theories, and I don't know actually which one, is most even compelling to me. I'm trying, I really try not to be like hyperbolic about this, like I said, or exaggerate the extent to which there's been a kind of stagnation, or even worse, what I just previously described as a cataclysm, as a sort of catastrophe that sort of deteriorated the entire kind of the ability for the status quo anti culture to even produce new stuff. Like the soil was just like no longer fertile for some reason. Okay, how did it get arid? Like how did that happen? Okay, so well, no, it's two questions. A, is that correct? Is that a correct assessment? And or is that overblown? That's one question. And then the second question is, if true, or to the extent it's true, how did it get that way? I'm going to pass on the first question of whether or not it's true. I'm just going to assume it's true. Okay. I'm going to just say that it's true. I'm going to say that the totality of anecdote from other people involved in different aspects of the culture, plus my own direct experience, plus just like what I see that exists out there, leads me to believe that it's like largely dead. It's largely incapable of producing new stuff.
It's dead wood
Um,
ready for a burn. No.
yeah, yes, frankly, yes. Okay, so there's the okay,
And why?
so one theory is that it's just digital, it's the internet. Okay, we've young people who are responsible, millennials who ought to be responsible right now for producing new stuff, were captured in their formative years by the internet and by a kind of experience and set of behaviors that degraded the ability to concentrate long enough to make good, complex pieces of art. Um, People who might have had the talent or inspiration to do that were able to satisfy the artistic impulse towards creative validation in these like short spurts of maybe tweeting or TikTok videos or whatever. And there's never then what that eliminates is the incentive to sit quietly by yourself, undistracted, and produce something over the course of months or years without any feedback, which is what it takes to write a novel. And maybe like they're just all the incentives are wrong to do that. All the sort of behaviors that are incentivized by it, like digital media, just militate against that. Okay, that's one explanation. Another explanation is that there's been this weird inversion in our culture where the left, having gained institutional supremacy, wanted to preserve its power in culture and institutions. And so at some point, let's say after the long march through the institutions, the left is now in control. They erect their set of values, their narratives, their sort of preferred aesthetics, and these kind of idols are in place. And previously, the left's job to come in whenever the culture got stale and break down those idols of aesthetics, those pillars of aesthetics and narratives, and then be the troublemakers who come in and create something new and allow the culture to evolve. So suddenly the left now is in this unfamiliar position of being the people trying to preserve the status quo culture. Over the course of some number of decades, it just gets stale and boring, and these things just become cliches and platitudes, and they degrade into this like terrible kind of wokeness. And the right, conversely, is in the very unfamiliar position to be the ones with a battering ram who need to come in and break this stuff and start something new. So both sides are dispositionally predisposed to doing the opposite of what they're like required to do given this like particular weird context that we're in over the last, I don't know, 20, 30 years. And it's only now, and this is like partly how I see our project, partly how I see like the online right and the kind of, it's like maybe a little vulgar, but the kind of trollish nature of it. It's like impish. The
Yeah, the
Anon
tricks are
culture is
closely.
impish. They're troublemakers. Okay, so what is that? Like, okay, what it is cultural energy that is attempting to break apart the left's kind of stranglehold on things. And it's all, and this is why you see the left like so resistant to this. Like suddenly they're so prudish about bad words, okay, and humorous troublemakers. Okay, so this is all to say that I think that might have been part of this. So there's like the tech angle there, and then there's like this larger meta political cultural angle. And it's just now that the right is finding the right amount of tolerance for troublemaking to allow us to break this old ground and then start something new.
Yeah, there's the institutional and then the technological. I think both of those are valid. I think they're not exclusive either.
Right.
But I do want to make you choose.
Well,
Is there one
okay,
that's more important than the other,
yeah.
or are they about equal?
My belief is that it's the latter version. That the technological one is actually just it's like it has an effect on the modes, on the like form that the art will take, and people are figuring out how to best operate within these new mediums, let's call them. Okay, just but that's like a solvable problem, and it's fine. People will make cool stuff using the internet and TikTok, and people will. I have sentimental attachments to like the novel, for example. I want there to be good novels, and I think there is going to be a renaissance for that sort of art. But it may also just be that like we just find new mediums for like interesting storytelling and artistic expression. So that the former, the tech angle seems less like a less important explanation of what's happened. The real explanation, the thing that I think is most important here, most relevant, is the political one and the strange, unfamiliar position that both people on the right and left like currently find themselves in terms of who's in charge, like who are the outsiders. I'm not the first to comment on this, but it is a weird thing that the right is the counterculture now. That's unusual. And it's taking some time to figure out how that's supposed to express itself, especially when you have elements of the right, especially the. So this is interesting. Like when I talk to right wing donors or like people in these think tanks, for example, they're very
I
resistant
know
to
the
this
type.
idea
Yeah.
of troublemaking or just being like more experimental with artistic expression. And I'm constantly telling them, no, you have to just, you have to have like broader tolerance here. It can't just be all the same old stuff that you're familiar with. I know your conservative disposition makes that a hard thing for you to like swallow and maybe understand. But yeah, there's got, and yeah, more tolerance for experimentation and like weirdness.
What's the role of postmodernism in all of this?
Okay, that's an interesting question. Um, I think we have to just postmodernism. Obviously, okay, it depends on what we mean by postmodernism, but just let's just say like postmodernists at bottom are challenging the notion of deriving like truth claims. Let's just say that reality is a construction of words and concepts, and there's no there's no firm ground that you're ever going to find to stand on. And the degree to which you think you found firm ground to stand on is a delusion. It's all just a kind of amalgam of language and signs. Okay. Again, this is like an incomplete summary of what postmodernism is, but I think where it's relevant here, that should do. The right would say, okay, that's wrong. There is a ground floor here, and it's like religion, it's God, okay, let's say. Or like these deep biological aspects of being human that are impervious to these language games. And what we're trying to do as artists is discover and map that firm ground. Okay, something like that. And I would say there's a tendency on the right to want to dismiss the arguments and intuitions of the postmodern view of the world and just say anybody who is participating in these language games or identifying aspects of reality as we perceive it that are merely a kind of illusion of signs, we can just ignore them. We can dismiss those claims altogether. And all we're just concentrating on like the ground. We're just concentrating on the firm ground of God and human nature, truth and beauty, okay, something like that. I think that's reductive. I think the postmodernists have something interesting to say about reality. I think they have actually identified some very critical aspect of reality as it's perceived by us as individuals and socially, and the degree to which they've mapped through post. I think they're wrong maybe about like in the furthest reaches of what they're trying to express, maybe wrong, or they're too dismissive of the ground floor. But they provided a lot of interesting insights, and it's a mistake to dismiss that. It's a mistake to dismiss something someone has to say because like they're on the left or they're communists or because they're postmodernists or whatever. No, actually, okay, it's fine. It's fine to acknowledge that they're, or like we can take stuff from this. Like these are just, we should think about these things as little tools that can be brought to bear on how we construct reality or how we dig further into our understanding of the world. And then whenever they're not useful, you can just you throw them out. And I think there's like this almost like tribal resistance to engage with certain schools of philosophy or ways of thinking about storytelling like postmodernism or something. That's just like limiting, and frankly, it's like boring. No, okay, it's fine if you don't personally find use in it, but I think a broadly speaking, like the project that I'm trying to stand up, ought to be able to integrate these ideas. Like Nick Land, I think, is a good example of this. Is someone who can take these what are like alien ideas to the traditional right and integrate them into a view of the world that does actually get us closer to understanding what is true and what is not true.
Yeah, Nick is just fascinating because like I finally got to reading Heidegger in
Mm,
January. Interesting time to be reading Heidegger in
yeah,
January, but I just remember, oh, Nick Land's conception of time. This is very Heideggerian.
yeah,
This is something where there's a lot of echoes there, and there's some things about Nick's philosophy that's very well known, like his inspiration from Deleuze and Guattari,
yeah,
but yeah, he goes really deep and crosses these traditional political differences.
yeah.
Let's
He's a Marxist. Okay, I don't say that derisively. I don't mean that as a criticism. He just is. He takes capitalism as the central vehicle through which modernity and history uh, proceeds. He has a very different view of what we ought to do about that, the implications of capitalism being at the center of the sort of core of history. But he uses Marxism in this really interesting way. And I think it'd be foolish and very, I don't know, It's like this kind of like Philistine impulse that you sometimes see on the right. It's certainly, there's elements of it on the left too, but we're just going to close ourselves off to any ideas that are derived out of Marxism or something. I think that's just very foolish.
Yeah, there's something particularly interesting about postmodernism in this context. And it's hard to articulate this without playing into or taking a side in kind of recent Twitter debates. Hopefully, this will age well as people forget about that. And I just want to re-emphasize this is not really in that debate and not really sharing the same characteristics, which I think are really often the wrong characteristics in that debate. But there's an interesting similarity between the concept of the red pill in the Curtis Yarvin sense of seeing the mechanism of the cathedral,
Hmm.
the regime,
Hmm.
the operating system of power, essentially.
Yeah.
There are, I think, very real similarities between that and deconstruction of seeing these mechanisms of power and seeing these mechanisms of narrative. And I think that it's almost something that the kind of pre-postmodernist novels do even better than the actual postmodern or postmodern era novels, is that, or not necessarily novels, but like Shakespeare, for example, right, will expose an underlying thread, will expose a way that people are having misconceptions, misunderstanding, contradictions, self delusions, and he'll replace it with something else. He will supplant it, and then he will create a new. And it doesn't necessarily stop there. Very often, he will introduce the folly of that way of looking at the world, and it's done through different characters, and you
Hmm.
can see their tensions, and it's a beautiful thing. And you need both the exposing of the underlying wiring and the willingness to assert something new. And maybe let me know if you think that this is accurate. Maybe the right or especially right wing artists can learn something from the deconstruction and can learn something about the style and the kind of, once again, not to play into any existing political debates, but I think there is a real meaning to this word, the kind of empathy or empathetic style of left wing novelists.
Mm.
And then, if there are some left wing novelists listening to this podcast, what they can learn is that you have to assert something very real and very vital and almost like spiritual, or in many cases, literally spiritual. You need to be able to do both.
Yeah. Okay. That's interesting. I think you're right that well, let's just like, yeah, okay, you're a right wing novelist or an artist of some kind. My idea about what art is doing is that it is describing the world as it is. And the closer you get to the picture, to a kind of impression or description of the world as it is, the sort of better the art is. And I don't, this often gets confused for a literal realist, like I'm a proponent for like literal realist art. I don't mean that. I just mean the world and reality in all its spectacle and aspects, including this kind of what you're describing here as this sort of like postmodern is, or this attempt to describe the wiring underneath the outward visible structure. And what I would say is to a right wing novelist is, yeah, like you have to engage with the sort of empathetic style of the left. And the reason is because it's part of the fabric of the world as it is. And if you want to accurately map the world and reality and our experience in it, it requires an understanding of that aspect of the world. Like these people do exist. And like postmodernism and its ideas have had a profound effect on how people experience life and how we understand the world as a social from a social perspective. So you have to address it. Yes, you can be critical of it or whatever, but it's in there. It's like a part of what's out there. And so to successfully write anything or express anything artistically, you have to understand it. You have to have an understanding of it. And similarly, and this is like what I think actually the left, like why it suffered so badly, it has denied itself the ability to accurately and like truthfully reflect the world as it is, because there are aspects of the world as it is that run counter to its preferences. And this as a social matter, I also mean this in terms of what people are actually like what is it to be human. I would say one example of this, like one underlying aspect of this that I think underlies a kind of leftist view of the world, is that people are the same, people are equal in like all sorts of different dimensions. And I think what the maybe major distinction is on the right is that no, people are different. There's and not just different, there's like a hierarchy of value that can be assigned to those differences actually. And the I would say if the left wants to, and I think like leftist artists stumble on this sort of like by accident because they can't help just but be truthful about what they're seeing because they're good artists. And so they reflect that in their art. But a self-consciously like leftist art that doesn't allow itself to observe and reflect those differences in its creative expression is going to be lesser than, it's going to be a degraded kind of art. So you have to like, so yeah, that's what I would say. I would say you have to be willing to look at the world as it is, not as you want it to be. And I would say that's true of the right. Now, the reason I'm on the right and not on the left is because I think the world as it is reflects my preferences, reflects my viewpoint. And if I didn't believe that, I wouldn't be on the right. Okay. And I'm sure that's like tautological in some sense, but yeah, that's how I think about this question.
Yeah, I think the same question is people ask the same question as statesmen, right? To govern, to act. And there are many questions that are different, but one question that is the same is what is human nature? How, in what ways are people the same?
Hmm.
In what ways are people different? What is the good life? How should people behave? What is the kind of hierarchy of virtues? These are things that are valuable. They're valuable both to the statesman and to
Yes.
the artist,
Yes.
and in many cases are what make art so valuable to the statesman.
Yeah. Look, again, I'd say, okay, so why like communism fails, for example, or a lot of leftist ideology is an unwillingness to acknowledge these differences and the illusion that arises from that denial that you can just like socially engineer people to all get along and behave according to a kind of utopian ideal about what you want society to look like. An honest assessment of the human condition, I think, suggests no. As a statesman, we are operating within the constraints of what is possible, and not all things are possible. And we can't use policy to try to construct what we want, what we prefer, if what we prefer is not possible given the reality and constraints of human nature. And yeah, there's now where it's different is the artist is merely trying to describe what is real, what is true. The politician has some specific the understanding what is true for the politician is a means to an end. It's to accomplish some other thing, where for the artist it is the end in itself.
Yeah, what's interesting there is that, yeah, to accomplish some other end or to accomplish it in and of itself. I mean, Leo Strauss asks this in What is Political Philosophy? Or he defines this as when people engage in politics, they believe that there is some course of action that is better than some course of action. So they must believe that there is something that is good and something that is, you can say, something that is evil or something that is bad.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, in some cases, maybe this is looked down upon, but it's certainly a reality that the statesman acts for his own gain, the statesman acts to keep power. But in some ways, to engage in politics is also to believe in a vision of what is good and in what is real.
Yeah. Okay, but yeah, so I guess it's just it's a question of yes, the statesman
But
is
I
trying to
definitely
orient.
understand their underlying point. I definitely
Yeah,
understand. There's a kind of pursuit, and there's a very clear, like, practical when you see it. When you see, like, political propaganda, when you see a
yeah,
leaflet versus when you read Shakespeare, it's
yeah,
not the same.
yeah.
So I definitely agree with you. Agree with you there.
And I think the difference too is, and maybe it's an order of operations thing, but it's actually like really important in terms of how these two different like domains of human activity express themselves. The statesman is starting with the objective and then reverse engineering from that objective both an assessment of whether it's possible, but then also the means to achieve that objective. And because the means are secondary to the objective itself, the means then allow for, oh God, what's the right word here? Like less honesty or less integrity or something, or like a lesser commitment to like truth. You're like you're willing to be manipulative and use tricks of rhetoric and various like schemes basically to achieve the objective because that's what matters. The objective is what matters. When you when you erase the objective from the formula, as I think you should in art, and the thing of just telling the truth becomes the end in and of itself, you're also then committing yourself to a certain kind of integrity. You're committing yourself to a certain kind of purity. Yeah, again, like it sounds grandiose or something, but like the artist should feel that way. There has to be a kind of you're trying to entertain your reader or something, but there's a like a deeper there's more of an expectation of honesty, internal honesty about what it is you're doing that doesn't apply to the statesman. And this is why, like, when I hear a politician lie to me, I don't get angry. This doesn't bother me. In the same way, it doesn't bother me when a car salesman tries to sell me a car and is telling me half truths about the quality of the engine in this particular model because I'm aware of this arrangement and what they want out of me and what they're trying to achieve. If the artist, though, was that loose with their commitment to the truth, I would feel betrayed because the only thing I care about in that arrangement with them is that they are saying something honest about their impression of the world.
Yeah, I think that's such an important lesson to keep. I'm reminded of the distinction Leo Strauss makes between reason and revelation, where reason, the philosopher, the man of reason, is the one who questions everything. And revelation, a man of faith, there are certain things that you take as faith, that you
Yeah.
take. And this isn't an art to say that's necessarily negative. but you can sense it. You can tell a difference. And as you say, there's a time for everything. There's a role for both. And I think that people can sense a similar thing with art, where if there's art is very multivalent, as Henry Oliver puts it. It's something where you're looking at many different angles and you're revealing many different personalities and characters. Certainly the novel is this way.
Hmm.
And people can tell if there's like a certain angle that you can't even touch. I think people won't get angry if you end up like having a conclusion. There are certain conclusions, for example, in Macbeth. Macbeth is very clearly a villain. He very clearly is illegitimate, but there's not the same sense of, oh, you can't touch this.
Hmm.
And I think in many ways, I think in many ways there's, yeah, on the left, I think a lot of people can see this happening on the left. Like literally, we started this talking about DEI, like certain races, certain genders, certain orientations. You can't touch any of them.
Yeah.
You can't even joke about them,
Yeah.
and that's something that people will notice, and that's something that people will especially notice in their art. And it's not quite the same on the right. Like you'll have the 4chan style trolling. You'll have the, I think you don't really get canceled for stuff. You can have like different positions, and there are people in our circles who are fans of Marx, maybe not full on Marxists, but thinks he has important ideas to contribute. Fans of Foucault, fans of Deleuze and Guattari. Like these are things that exist on the right, but kind of there's a different kind of, you can't touch that on the right. I
Yeah.
can't quite put my hand on it, but
There's
I
no,
don't
you're
get.
right. There
Go on.
are like certain there's a certain kind of intolerance on the right for certain ideas, certain kinds of things. And it's generally what okay, so I think part of this is it comes from a position of weakness.
Yes,
Um
yes,
and so what the right is currently fearful of is that this kind of newfound ascendancy will quickly be colonized by all the same old leftist forces.
yes,
And
and the neocons.
then yeah, or just yeah, or the equivalent of, which is these entryists.
That's the history. That's the history, right?
Yeah,
The neocons, they
yeah,
literally were like, this is the literal thing that happened. They were former leftists who
totally. Yep.
then became in the Republican Party. You can argue whether they were conservative or not, but became members of the Republican Party and very powerful members of the Republican
Yeah.
Party. And so this is justified. Once again, everything has its place. But
Well,
sorry,
no, but this is so it's important that history is important because there is a kind of beaten dog mentality, and there's new owners now, but still every time they see a newspaper up in the air, they like cower in the corner and are like waiting to get beaten again. So what's happening here is because there's this kind of lingering sense of precarity that at any moment the rug will get pulled out from underneath, and what's going to happen is hostile or potentially hostile forces, or even just like these entryists will come in and dilute everything that matters and neuter this movement, and we'll just get stuck back in the same old kind of loop that we were in previously. And one way that concern manifests itself is through a certain intolerance for these hot, what you call these like hot to the touch issues. And it's okay. There are these certain things that you cannot touch because if you if there's like a tranny in your story, it doesn't matter in what context. You are validating the existence of this like category of person that we are ideologically objecting to, and you are inviting this the possibility of this like thing getting taken over by these entryist forces. I think it's weak. I think that attitude is very weak. It's very defensive. And I understand it. I don't like it, but I understand it. And I think there's, and or it's true too. Okay, let's say Passage found this really interesting author, but this author happened to be like, I don't know, a lib, okay, some lib novelist. And forget the what was inside the novel. It's just something. It's not political, whatever. It's just some story. But it's like well written, it's well crafted, it's like interesting love story, okay? It becomes like there's a tension publishing something like that. My feeling is the only thing that matters is it good? That's the only question that matters to me. But I perceive this same thing that maybe you're getting at here, which is there's still like the right is more open. I think the right definitely does have more openness to like all sorts of different ideas. But A, that might be short lived. And B, it comes with a certain number of exceptions. And there's this like ongoing kind of navigation that like I have to do, for example, to reconcile some of these little like hot to the touch issues that might still exist for the right.
I think I got an example that really encaptures it. Have you ever been accused of taking teal bucks?
I get accused of that daily. Peter, please write me a check so I can like I'm happy to, that's one example. The interesting thing about that though is I don't think people actually really care about that. I don't think it would be like a big deal if Peter Thiel was actually funding all these cultural projects on the right. Um yeah, I just don't think it matters. I think it only matters because there's like a certain segment of the right that is perhaps feeling left out of this emergent new thing. And like accusing you of getting teal bucks is a way to pull you back into the ghetto. Okay. I think it's something like there's like a subculture. Okay, this is just like cultural evolution works. There's like subculture, and then if that subculture starts to gain sort of interest and energy and attention, there's just going to be this like inflection point in which it starts cycling into the mainstream culture. And that's just how this works. That's just how cultures evolve over time. I think that's
Absolutely.
starting to happen. That evolution, that movement out of this kind of subcultural ghetto into more mainstream culture. But there are aspects of the subculture that remain in the ghetto and are going to remain in the ghetto. And they want to, it's crabs in a bucket. They want to pull people back down into the ghetto where they are. I think that's like part of the dynamic. Basically, accusing someone of getting teal bucks is accusing them of selling out. Okay.
Yes,
That you might just
exactly.
think about it like that these are like equivalent accusations. And it's I think mostly just grounded in a kind of resentment, honestly.
What's interesting though is that related to all of this is the whole kind of tech right
Yeah.
conversation, right? And it's interesting because I'm not sure it can be so easily dismissed. We talked about earlier the very real history of the neocons
Hmm.
and people coming in and really, I think, determinatively changing the direction of the Republican Party. I think that
Completely.
happened. I think that was
Yeah.
real. And on one hand, there are versions of it that are unfair. There are versions of it that are maybe not conducive to good art. But in terms of a political concern, I think it's a real political concern. And
Totally.
and it's valid in some ways, but understanding at the same time, I think it's really difficult to understand the kind of the discourse, the posting around Elon and the tech right and the suspicion of Elon. I think it's really hard to understand without understanding this dynamic, without understanding this kind of yeah. What did you call it? Like the bitten dog or the
Yeah.
beaten dog
The beaten dog.
mentality?
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
Okay, I've written about this. Go to my Substack, Lomez.press. I have a two-part series on the neocons. I have to write part 3. A lot's changed in the last couple of weeks, but in both
What's
part
changed?
1 and part 2, I say explicitly that as I'm describing the neocon sort of, they didn't take over the right. That's hyperbolic. It's a little bit more complicated than that, and there are multiple waves of neocons. But in any case, the first wave of neocons in the 60s and 70s that found their way into conservative politics from the left. Famously, Irving Kristol was a Trotskyite. He was a member of the Fourth International. Um, it was like short lived. It's there. It's in there. It's in their politics. Who were disillusioned by various leftist excesses over the course of the 60s and 70s, both on a cultural front, but also with regards to like crime and the excesses of the civil rights movement, very similar to what we see with wokeness. And we see a lot of these guys become a part of the right in much the same way that someone like Bill Ackman has found his way to the right, and the All In guys and Mark Andreessen, for example, as he's described it in various podcasts. And what those early neocons did, the way that this analogy matches in another way is they brought a kind of level of sophistication and like mainstream legitimacy to conservative politics that had previously been viewed by places like the New York Times as this sort of unsophisticated, vulgar, regressive political movement. Similarly, when these all in guys come into conservative politics, again, Mark Andreessen, et cetera, suddenly the New York Times has a newfound respect for the MAGA coalition, okay? Because it's now serious, competent, smart people who they identify with as a on a, like a social class level are now participating in this ideological movement, and they treat it with a certain amount of respect now, and they lend the right a certain amount of credibility. And this is very seductive to conservative think tanks who go, oh, this is really nice to have the New York Times saying nice things about us. All of a sudden, we've never experienced this before. And are people writing in support of policies that we believe in? They're getting their stuff written up in these fancy academic journals. They're like, this is great. We love this. And we want to encourage more of this. And they invite the neocons into their world. And over time, the neocons rise to levels of greater and greater prominence within these organizations. And pretty soon, the kind of more hardline conservative right wing messaging gets diluted, gets watered down, and just then does become the messaging of the neocon preference. Okay, what does this happen with tech, and what are some of the specific things that people are worried about? Chiefly immigration, and this is why that H-1B flare up on Twitter over Christmas was so interesting because you saw for the first time these like fault lines and what kinds of compromises the right might have to make in order to preserve this relationship with the tech people. I think the right won that argument around H-1Bs and around immigration broadly. I think the tech people underestimated how salient that was and capitulated. But I don't actually think that's going to be the main fault line. And it remains to be
Oh, interesting.
seen what happens when the real fault lines emerge. And I think that actually is going to happen around like bioethics, around
Oh,
things
yeah.
like genetic engineering, embryo selection, all sorts of sci-fi Gattaca sounding technologies that frankly are anathema to many on the right, and where there isn't really like an obvious like negotiation path because these things rest on like fundamental values. There isn't like some obvious sort of transactional way to there is with immigration where you can give a little bit here and then not there. You
Yes,
know,
you can literally say we're gonna accomplish this many deportations, and then we're gonna change the
and you can
visa
have
cap.
this many high performing H-1Bs, but not the lower tier. Okay, yeah, you could do all that. You can't really do that with like iterative embryo selection. Okay, that's either allowed or it's not, and or artificial wombs. Okay, something like that.
Surrogacy
This
is a big
this
one.
runs so counter to the moral intuitions of many people on the incumbent right. I and but then on the other hand, this is like a critical part of this futuristic worldview that is important for the tech people. And so I'm like, I don't know what happens there. I don't know what happens there.
Yeah, that part is just fascinating, and all of the social dynamics we were talking about, RFK versus all of
Yeah.
these seed oil lobbyists. It's a big dynamic in the changing Republican Party. Do you ever worry that this is just almost like a time bomb?
The coalition together, you mean?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So I do think that there are going to be certain issues where there's irreconcilable differences and where like a single debate over a particular issue could it just tear the entire thing apart. I was at a conference in Miami recently, and there was a guy there presenting on a technology that he was working on, and I'll just like give a brief overview. So it's like you clone embryos and it grows up alongside the child, but it's been genetically engineered to not have a brain. It has a brain stem, but not a brain. So it's like a zombie person, a clone. And as the like actual 1.0 version grows up, if at any time the 1.0 version needs like a new organ, okay, like a heart transplant or like a liver, you just go to the zombie brainless clone and you like cut it out and you insert the organ into the 1.0 version. And okay, the pitch is this is going to help resolve issues around health and this will extend life, and okay, the thing doesn't have a brain, so it's not actually experiencing any suffering, etc. And someone in the crowd who's on, let's just say, the other side of the right, the non-tech side of the
This is
right,
just satanic.
yeah, he raises his hand. He goes, "Okay, I object to this." And the guy goes, "You mean you have like moral objections?" He says, "Yes, I have moral objections to this. Of course, I have moral objections to this. And the fact that you would even wonder why I have moral objections to this means that there's no debate to be had here." And the scientist was like, "I don't know, like." What would you do? Like, how would you regulate something like this? And he goes, honestly, if I was in charge, two men in like black suits would come to your hotel room tonight carrying submachine guns, and they would throw you off the balcony, and they would then go on to assassinate every single person who you work with and all its affiliates, and you would never be heard from again. And there was this kind of like moment of silence like descends on the room, and everybody's waiting around for the punchline. There's no punchline, like that's it.
The
And I
punchline
was thinking to
death.
myself, okay, yeah, this is the fault line. Like you don't like there's no negotiation here. And yeah, this is maybe an extreme version of each position, but not really. And so I don't know. I don't sitting here have a easy answer for how to reconcile these two things. And it just may be that that's the point at which this coalition sort of splits, and a certain number of humanist tech people move into the right. But then there's another sort of more progressive tech element that finds another home that's willing, political home that's willing to accommodate whatever it is they're up to. And we descend into some kind of civil war, or these people are off on their Mars colony doing their genetic engineering or what, I don't know. But yeah, I do think I don't want to say the short term, over the medium term, there may be some just impossible to reconcile differences of opinion.
Yeah. One of those differences in opinion. And like I've tried my best to stay away from the Twitter discourse so far, but this part I just find fascinating is the question of collective right, because I think this goes to the fundamental divide of all of it, and I think it's just an important philosophical question as well. Do you have rights as an American citizen, special rights as an American citizen, special rights as someone who, what's the JD Vance line, has had 5 generations die in the same burial plot?
Yeah.
Um, and I think the big question is something like, first of all, is it just to have collective rights? That's one of the big questions. But the one I'm almost more interested in is the question of meaning, right? This is
Mm.
something that comes up over and over again. Do you need a collective right, a collective spirit, a collective will to have pride in your country, to
Yeah.
believe in things, to really be motivated to do things? Is that why people are so unmotivated? I know that's a very broad question, but
No, I do think that. I think that one of the one aspect of our current sort of political, social, cultural pathologies is this hyper individualistic. I don't even want to say hyper individualistic because that on its own is not entirely the problem, but
the word I've heard, and we can talk more about it as well, is managerial, right? Very managerial, very quantified, statistics based.
okay, what I was, yeah, and so what's managing people's lives is this sort of formal kind of government structure or these like formal institutions rather than the informal entities of like local community or something. Okay, so as local community has broken apart and there's been this kind of alienation from identity and from a collective identity. What then manages the texture and meaning of people's lives are these like big overarching structures. And what I think like JD Vance is referencing is that we need to derive meaning out of our like flesh and blood identity and those relationships to like kin networks and extended kin networks that or for which like social identity, a kind of formal governmental identity is not a substitute. Okay, what am I saying here? Like that yeah, the we need to be able to understand ourselves in terms of the old modes of like local tribe, our families, people who look like us, people who sound like us. And we can't just live in a kind of completely heterogeneous nation where all of those kinds of connections are severed. And the only thing that organizes our life is like this very high level, top level sort of institutional identity. And this dovetails with the immigration question. Okay, then what does it mean? What does it mean to be like an American? What does it mean to have a relationship with the people who live in the town I'm in or the city I'm in? Is all of that stuff like meaningless? And instead, it's just this like sort of facade of America over the top of everything, something like that.
What's fascinating, or let me give you a bit of background on how I'm thinking about this. The biotech, I think, is a bigger question, but on technology in general, I'm quite optimistic. And at the same time, I think that there's something else. The question of virtue, I don't think is necessarily degraded by technology, but is something that's often not pursued in the modern day, and is not intrinsically pursued by technology. I think that you can do both, but you have to choose. You have to choose to do both. And something that really leaped out at me from my first interview with James Pogue is I was asking him about the origin of the new right. And he said something like, everything around us, it feels like all of the magic has been sucked out of it. And he comes from a historically left wing tradition, but he sees this and he sees this as something that is now a right wing idea or is now a right wing motivation. And I think he's right to see it that way. And there's something that happened. There's something that happened to everyone. And I think especially to people in the tech world. I do think that where the American mind is now configured in this very brutalist way, very fully utility focused. Sometimes there's a place for that too, but that is not thinking about things in a romantic or a proud or a spiritual or even magical way. They're just not thinking in that mode. They've turned that part of their brain off. It really is an open question of whether you can get that back and how you can back and get that back. It's really a question of culture. It's I just feel like we're in a place where the answers are not coming yet. Maybe that will change soon, but I feel like we're in a place where tech has no answers to that, or the answers they have are really bad. The traditional right, they have some answers to that I think are good. I think you should go to church, but they're not fully able to take up that mantle either. I guess to pose it in the form of a question is like, what can we do, right? Where does that come out of? If you even agree with my premise for all of this at all.
Okay,
Yeah,
so
yeah.
I think no, I think you're right. I think the word you hear that describes this sense of magic being lost as we in the way that we experience the world is that the world has become disenchanted.
Yeah.
And what we're trying to do is re-enchant the world. And okay, why has it been disenchanted? Okay, I oh man, we could just have another 2.5 hours just on this question. But one reason might be, and this gets back to the point I was like struggling to make a minute ago, which is that our lives have been institutionalized. There's part of what tech does is improve efficiency to such a degree and improve kind of comfort to such a degree, and that our lives also map onto a script that is very narrow, especially if you come from a certain kind of background. It's very well understood what kind of life you're going to have by the time you're like 12. You see it all
Yeah,
mapped out
this is
ahead of you.
this is what I hate about the proposed Vivek childhood.
Yes.
In many ways, that was my childhood, and
Yeah.
I think it was all of these things. There are goods and there are ills, but I think that there were better options. But sorry, I interrupt.
No, that's right. And but it's not just true for, kids with like tiger moms anymore. It's like true for everybody, at least like in a certain social class. Like a lot of this has been mediated through like youth sports, but that's okay. That's a separate question. But okay, there's been this kind of institutionalization of life, technology that provides this incredible amount of efficiency and this very narrow script about what a good life is, what a modern American life looks like. And what's lost in all of this is a kind of chaos and spontaneity. And chaos on its own is like value neutral, but what chaos allows for, this is what I like about Trump so much. I've written about this quite a lot, is it creates these little moments of chaos. And in these little moments of chaos, what that means is no, you're not operating on a script anymore. Everything is now being improvised. And all of a sudden, what this does is allows people to express their true preferences that may have been hidden even to themselves, and their true competencies. Like, how good am I? How well can I navigate this like novel and weird environment that I'm suddenly in? And um modern life, maybe all life is like this, maybe it just feels like this, maybe we're being solipsistic about this, but it certainly seems like modern life, to a greater degree than in the past, has lesser and lesser moments of this kind of organic spontaneity and chaos that allows for some more honest and real revelation of who we are. Like, and what the right maybe is trying to do is in part rediscover that. And the way to rediscover that, maybe, is by eliminating the institutional architecture that is governing modern life. So you knock out like the importance of college and all the kind of restrictions around like dating dynamics and just like all of these prescriptions about how we're supposed to live. The right is just reacting against that stuff and just saying, okay, no, throw all that stuff out. We want to create environments in which there is going to be a little bit of chaos and a little, which will require some improvisation and spontaneity. And okay, I don't know if this, I'm like riffing here. We're 2.5 hours in, and I don't know. I don't want to like, I'm not marrying myself to this idea because there's something else going on with the return to like tradition and, like you said, going to church and stuff. But that seems incomplete. That's important, but also related to some other impulse that's separate from re-enchanting the world and our experience in it. Okay, you're younger than me, but like one thing I know from talking to younger people is you don't just like, meet someone at the supermarket and start dating that person. Okay, no. The way that you find a girlfriend is you like go on to one of these dating apps and you scroll through forever and then you find a match and that's like how you get a girlfriend. There's something so mechanical about that is just, oh god, it really does cut against any kind of possibility for magic in the world. And so, yeah, you're right, this is something that's animating the right, is a search and an attempt to recapture these moments of spontaneity.
There's two things here, and I'm not sure if they should be unified or if they are separate. I think that the right at its best, its most unified, its most proud, are like taking some of these crazy defunct norms, these kind of like pseudo rules, bureaucracies, whatever, and saying we're not doing this anymore. We're gonna say retard again.
Yeah, yeah,
We're not doing the DEI trainings. It's okay to be white,
yeah,
and that I think brings everyone together. And it can be the tech right, it can be Elon. Elon's a poster. It can be
yeah.
Mark, and it can also be the Anons. It's everyone. We all agree. The other part that I think is harder, and at least I think it is different. I haven't thought about this very thoroughly, but it feels different at least. Is this mechanization, what you were talking about with Tinder or with LinkedIn or just how people go about their lives, optimizing for the metrics. That's something where, or like scrolling Twitter, scrolling the Twitter feed. That's something where it's really automated, it's really mechanical,
Mhm.
it's like this base nature. And I am guilty of this. I'm on Twitter all the time. I'm sure you're on Twitter a lot as well. You have good posts, but like it is this kind of base side of us, and we do this. It's it's something that we choose to do, right? It's not
Mhm.
necessarily like the other thing where it's this thing that we have to comply with. No, we choose to open the Twitter app and we choose to read the posts and write our tweets. But it's also this very kind of mechanical or addictive thing that's happening. And that I think is where there's more of a tension between the technological side and you can say the old right or the populist side. What do you make of that distinction?
Yeah, that's really interesting. Is a strain of kind of neo Ludditism on the right. And it's like less prominent now than it was probably like 4 to 8 years ago. Like There used to be what was called like Pine Tree Twitter. And it was like these kind of Kaczynskiite sort of Ed Zerzin style. Well, Zerzin's more of a lefty, but like Linkola acolytes. And the like underlying ethos was a kind of like rejection of these tech elements, like totally. Nuke Silicon Valley. I think I tweeted that at one point. I'm sure I did actually. And so there's that strain. There is that strain, but that actually, interestingly enough, and I'd be interesting to like map out how this happened. That has waned for sure, and the right, the
I mean,
sort
I
of
think it's just the friend enemy distinction, right? Elon's friend now.
yeah, that's right. And also, yeah, this kind of like looking around and thinking, no, actually, what would be good here? What's actually promoting the underlying values of what it means to be a sort of like vital person in the world is, yeah, building rocket ships and going to Mars. That's actually, that's more of an expression of this of the thymos of the self than bugging out and building a cabin in the woods and just doing this kind of, yeah, the primitive lifestyle thing. There was, yeah, there was like this moment where it was unclear like which direction the right was going to go between those two things. I like found myself like riding that line a little bit too. But no, then it's no tech. I think part of it too is just the inevitability of tech. It's I sometimes just throw up my, even with the bioethics stuff, I just throw up my hands and go, you could be opposed to this morally, but you can't stop it. Again, this is
Oh,
where my
even with the
underlying,
bio,
huh?
even with the bio stuff.
Just tech generally, yeah, all this stuff. You can't stop it. There's no stopping it. Like, and this is where I was talking about previously about being like honest about how the world is rather than how I wish it ought to be. And if you're like honest and you just go, you know what, I don't like this, but there's no stopping it. It's inevitable. And once you, if you commit yourself to that, that completely changes your sort of political orientation and just how you live your own life. Like, what does that then mean for me and my kids and my future and how I raise them and whether or not I give them access to an iPad? If I believe, if I make an honest assessment of the world and think, okay, the like tech is inevitable, whether I like these people or not, whether I think this tech is good or not, it's happening. It's just going to happen and it's going to swallow the world. Okay, then I got to make a decision based on that reality. And I have to make optimal decisions based on that reality. It is not viable to operate as if that's not true just because I don't want it to be true. And I think there's been some kind of recognition broadly on the right that tech is inevitable. So what does that mean? It means you have to ride the wave. You can't swim against this current. So yeah.
It's interesting. I'm thinking that through a lot. I think there's a lot there. My worry with the I think that's a good attitude to have. The underlying almost like metaphysics, I think, is really good to have. If there's something inevitable, you should just recognize it. Um, I'm not sure it is inevitable because I think it's. I think the possibility of a kind of totalitarian reaction to technology is actually quite likely. I think
Hmm.
that it already exists in some corners of the internet, more so on the left or the kind of. Do you know about the effective altruists? Surely
Yep.
you must.
Yep.
Peter Thiel is talking about this now. Actually, the kind of antichrist, the kind of desire for a one world government,
Yeah.
and this kind of neo war on terror view where like everyone could be a bioterrorist, everyone must be surveilled.
Yeah.
I think that's I think that people should at least consider it to be a possibility that those people win. Even now, even in a moment where the right is ascendant, I think that first of all, I think that what Mark said, that like the timeline split, I think that's absolutely true. I think that's absolutely true for AI. I think it's absolutely
Yeah.
true for social media and censorship and a few other things. But I also don't think they're like I don't think they're out. They might be down, but they're not out. The totalitarians, and it can be like an older version of the totalitarianism, or a newer version. But that's why it almost feels like recapitulating history, and that's why I'm so interested in both Hobbes and Schmidt in
Yeah.
particular, is
But
because there is
well,
this kind of confrontation, I think.
okay, but I don't necessarily think that what we're saying is incompatible. So there's a certain path where tech goes down this totalitarian route, and maybe that's even like the most likely. Okay, like the Peter Thiel thesis. There's this other route where it's Mark Andreessen's optimist vision for tech, and maybe there's some other third route. Okay, but in any of these cases, the flow of history, the flow of tech proceeds forward. Okay, that and so what I'm saying is that motion that's the motion that's inevitable, is the push forward. And so then the question, if that's true, and there are these like different shoots that it can go down, what then our job becomes, what our thinking is then is, okay, how do we direct this in the towards the optimistic version? What that doesn't entail, though, is some option where we dam it up and it doesn't move forward anymore. That's a waste of time and energy. And or if you're merely just trying to dam it up, maybe you slow it down for a little bit, but eventually it finds low ground. Water flows downhill, and so if downhill by default, if we do nothing, and downhill is the totalitarian path, then damming it up doesn't prevent the totalitarian path from coming to fruition. It maybe slows it down. Best case scenario, it slows it down for a little bit. But what that means is if right now the totalitarian path is downhill, then what we need to do is dig a deeper trench for the optimistic path. We should be spending all our energy making that path the downhill path for this inevitable flow.
Yeah, that's wise words to live by. I think we're running low on time, but I want to save a block of time for this unrelated question. Of all of the books you've published at Passage Press, which one is your favorite?
Oh man. Oh my gosh. Okay. I have a soft spot in my heart for Unqualified Reservations Volume 1 because it was the first book that we ever did, that I ever did. And we had the Passage Prize, which was a collection of stories and stuff that people sent to me that I feel very sentimental towards. But when I thought, okay, actually, maybe there's something more here, you Are One was the first like piece of text that I thought I could turn into a book and sell and maybe start a company based around that premise. I, of course, and I feel incredibly grateful for to Curtis for letting me do that and just like saying, you know what? Yeah, man, I trust you. Go do it. And despite my mistakes, like he never yelled at me or anything for my mistakes. He was very gracious. So thank you, Curtis. And then let us proceed to do future books of his. I will say though that Steve Saylor's book, I have been reading Steve Saylor for so long, and I always thought Steve got a bad rap and was people just abused him and treated him unfairly, and he was held up as this like bad guy, and he was always just like the nicest and most reasonable guy, and you could just sense that through his writing. He was also funny, and he had this analytical style that I loved. I loved the way that he wrote and thought about the world. And I always wanted to meet him, and I never did until I came up with the idea to publish his book. And I got a chance to sit down and hang out with Steve at a lunch one day and just tell him how much I appreciated him. And he was, again, like, he was so gracious, he was so nice. And then publishing that book, I think, even more so than the Curtis book, which was almost like proof of concept, was really the book that like announced that what we were doing was real, like a real viable thing. I'm very proud of that book. I'm really, like, obviously, okay, I'm going to say this, but there are aspects of all the books we published that I'm very proud of for different reasons. The two fiction collections, the short story collection by V.N. Ebert, which is a great piece of short fiction, contemporary short fiction, totally new. And then this novel, Something of the Springtime, by a young writer named John King Spiezio. Like, my goal for this project was, or part of the bet I was making, was that there's like this untapped talent out there. There are a bunch of like people who can write and have something to say, who are being ignored for very petty and stupid reasons that have nothing to do with merit or the quality, or their talent or marketability or anything like that. And that if I dangled out some bait, I could draw this talent in. And there was then this skeptical part of me that thought, oh, maybe not. Maybe there isn't the talent out there, and maybe this is all going to be for naught, and I'm not going to find anything that's good. So when I found those books and those writers and was able to publish them, it felt like a vindication of the larger sort of objective of this project. So I'm leaving something out that I also feel very proud of, I'm sure, but it's not coming to mind right now. So I'll just leave it at that.
Yeah, that's the call. That's the call of destiny.
Yeah.
It's a beautiful thing, and I think we want more of that in the future. We want
Also,
that.
Xeno Systems. Okay, look at me. I'm wearing this hat, and I forgot to say Xeno Systems. The reason
Yeah.
I didn't say Xeno Systems because it was a nightmare. It was a nightmare editorially to put together for reasons that have nothing to do with Nick. It was just very complicated given the nature of his blog. And anyway, but I love that book. I love Xeno Systems. I love the way it turned out, the physical form of it. It feels really nice. I think it looks really nice. So very proud of that book too.
Any future releases we should be excited?
Yeah, we have a really great catalog coming out soon for 2025. Our first four books that are coming out spring summer are Raag Nationalist, his book called The Last Men, which is,
What a name! Yeah,
it's great. And you know,
sorry,
so what
Tom.
it is, it's like it's detailing the like what's happened with male health over the last 30-40 years. And rather than talking about it from like a cultural sociological perspective, he gets into studies around radically declining testosterone rates and sperm counts, and that there's something really insidious happening with our diet and environment that's creating a lot of these problems, but fortunately lend themselves to certain kinds of fixes if we're willing to muster the political will to enforce them. So I think it's a really good book. It's a really important book. It's not just like shit posting. It's actually really well researched and well written book. He's an Oxford scholar who, despite his online persona, is a very serious and smart guy, and he's a really good writer. So I'm really excited for that book. We have a collection from Paul Gottfried, the great Paul Gottfried. So it's like our Sailor anthology. It's a collected works from Paul Gottfried. Taki of Taki's Mag, and he was the Spectator columnist forever. It's called The Last Alpha Male, and it's his memoir about boozing and womanizing and gambling and his escapades fighting communists and being this interesting right wing figure over the course of the 20th and early 21st century. And what else am I forgetting? I'm forgetting another really important book that is coming out spring, summer. Oh man, I can't think of it. It's okay. We're 3 hours into the call. Okay, that's my excuse.
All good,
So,
all good, all good.
oh man. So, but then yeah.
And
So
we
then
can add it after if you think of
yeah.
it.
No, it's fine. It's fine. And Fascicles is out now. That's Curtis Yarvin's new book. So that's available. I encourage everybody to go buy it alongside the ones I've mentioned previously. There's a ton of great stuff. What am I forgetting? Oh man. Oh, Hollywood Samizdat, a guy who by Rambo Van Halen. Great account on Twitter. He worked in Hollywood for a long time in production, and it's his kind of notes from anecdotes from working in Hollywood. Very good book, very funny, lighthearted stories. Yeah.
Awesome. And for those listening, you can find those at passage.press. You can find Lomez on Twitter at Lomez with the numbers. They'll be linked below. And his Substack will also be linked below too. Anything else that I should include?
I don't think so. I don't think so. I think that's plenty. I
Yeah, and
appreciate it,
I
Brian.
want to
This was
feel
actually a really good
absolutely
conversation. I
beautiful.
enjoyed it.
Yeah, great to have you on. I enjoyed it very much as well. So much to think about. Amazing things are happening. Yeah, and here's to the re-enchanted future.
The good timeline, okay? That's what we're calling it. All right, Brian. Thanks, man.